In this podcast, you'll learn how to make your English more colourful and descriptive. We're looking at similes, a type of figurative language that compares two different things using the words like or as. Welcome to the podcast that is like a ray of sunshine in your otherwise grey and cloudy day. Welcome to
Up and Daring Les with Reza and Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And I'm Craig.
And with nearly 60 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. You're all very welcome, particularly if you're a new listener. Craig, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, my friend. I really liked the simile that you used in the introduction to this podcast. A ray of sunshine, like a ray of sunshine in your otherwise grey and cloudy week. That's quite a depressive picture you've painted there of our listeners' life, I think.
Well, yes, they're terrible lives, but they've always got us to save them from their terrible lives. We are the ray of sunshine. We're only joking, listeners. We are sure that your lives were perfectly fine even before you heard of us.
In fact, this podcast might even make them worse. Who knows?
We might bring you down, actually. We hope not, though.
We hope not. So let's start by looking at similes and first describing what they are. What is a simile? Well, it compares two different things. And the way we compare two different things is by using the word like or two ases. In other words, as, blah, 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 as. For example, Reza is as tall as a tree.
He's exaggerating. I'm not that tall.
Notice
I'm as tall as a not very tall tree.
As tall as a bush. As lovely as a flower. Notice the two ases there. It's really important to have those two ases, the as and the as, both sides of the adjective. As tall as quick as small as, etc. Another example, she's as cool as a cucumber. She's very, very cool.
And with the word like, she ran like the wind. Or I slept like a baby.
So it's really saying similar to, isn't it? When you say like, you're saying she slept similar to a baby, or she ran similar to the wind, like the wind. So a simile, it paints a mental picture for the listener instead of just giving a boring description. And why do we use them? Well, visual impact, first of all. I just said paint a picture. So you're creating a picture to make the language more attractive and to make what you're saying more memorable. You're also emphasizing, because you can say that something is very quiet. That's fine, that's okay. Everybody understands that something is very quiet. But if you say they are as quiet as a mouse, it's much more expressive. You're thinking of a mouse. That's where you're creating the picture. Instead of saying he's very nervous, you can say he's as nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof.
Also, one interesting aspect of similes is that there's a great cultural connection because many similes are idiomatic. That means that they kind of reflect the thinking behind the language. So when you think about similes or you use them, it reflects how English speakers see the world. This is why in English we have our similes and in Spanish you have yours, and some of them are more or less the same. They can be translated directly because they're very common ideas, universal ideas, but there are other similes which are very particular to the English language because in the English-speaking world we think that way. Just like in Spanish, you have your own similes if you're a Spanish speaker because you think that way in the Spanish-speaking world.
So that's really why we use similes. Let's look a bit deeper and in more detail about the grammar. And then after, stay around and listen because we're going to give you lots of examples of common similes that native speakers use in everyday English. So the grammar, as we mentioned before, as plus the adjective, plus as, plus a noun. For example, as cold as ice, or as busy as a bee, or as strong as an ox.
What's an ox, Craig?
It's like a cow. Isn't an ox a male cow? Or is it similar to a cow? A cow is
I think
usually...
it's a bit bigger though, isn't it?
A cow's always female, isn't it?
Yeah, unless you use the kind of generic, but yeah.
So it's like a big bull, an ox.
Yeah, but I think it's actually bigger than a normal cow.
Right.
I think it's bigger, slightly bigger.
But they're very strong. You often
strong.
see them in Asian countries pulling things in fields. They're very strong animals.
Exactly. So don't think of the normal cow in a field that you use to get milk from. No, think of the strong, slightly bigger one that pulls things in Asia. That's an ox. So as strong as an ox.
Now, we never change the form of the adjective in these similes. For example, we would not say as busier as a bee. So we keep the adjective the same in its basic form, as busy as a bee. So never use a comparative adjective, just use the basic adjective.
One thing you will notice, though, in modern English, it wasn't the case 50, 60 years ago, but some people sometimes don't actually say the first as. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
These days you might hear people saying, for example, he's cold as ice instead of he's as cold as ice. Some people will drop the first as. I don't know how common it is, but you will hear it sometimes.
That's a good point. Absolutely. The other way to form a simile is to use like. So you'd use a verb, for example, to eat, and then like, which I said before means similar to, and then a noun or perhaps a gerund. For example, she eats like a bird. She doesn't eat a lot of food. She eats like a bird, very little food. Or I slept like a log. It's been a hard day's night. I've been sleeping like a log, as the Beatles famously sang. Have you got an example with a gerund, Reza?
Yes, what about this one? How boring. It's like watching paint dry.
Bit like our podcast, eh?
Oh, hopefully not. Hopefully.
It's like listening to paint dry.
Even worse. So watching is a gerund. It comes from the verb to watch in the ing form. It's like watching paint dry is a simile, which means it's very boring. Can you imagine watching paint dry? How boring would that be?
Very, very boring. Yes. If you eat in a very disgusting, horrible way, you could say that he eats like a pig, because you've all seen pigs eat, or maybe you have on TV at least. You've seen how messy and how horrible they eat. So if you're eating like a pig, then obviously you're not eating very politely.
There's a very famous quotation that came from the American boxer Muhammad Ali. He famously once said, "Fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee." So he's using two similes there. So fly like a butterfly, move around light, but sting like a bee. When you punch, make it really hurt.
Now, those are obviously positive similes, but of course you can reverse the simile to make it negative, and then it becomes quite humorous. For example, I am not Muhammad Ali, I don't box. So I could say, to be funny, I fly like a house and I sing like a mouse. Or I sting like a mouse, or I sing like a cat. So reversing it to what it actually means can make it quite humorous. Let's take a quick break here, because I know you listen to this podcast to take your English to the next level. But what about your speaking? Is your fluency improving? Are you happy with your speaking skills? My conversation course focuses on making you a more confident and more fluent English speaker. You'll join me and a small group of motivated students, and we'll meet on Zoom and have topical discussions, role plays, debates, and presentations that will expand your vocabulary and help you express yourself effectively in English. So be proactive and take the first step
towards becoming a confident and fluent English speaker. Send me an email today to craig@inglespodcast.com and I'll send you details of the next online conversation course. Thanks for listening. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
Craig, let's list some very common similes. What about if we start with as and then later we'll move on to like?
Good idea.
So, first with as. A very common simile is as blind as a bat. That means you can't see very well. He's as blind as a bat. His glasses are very, very thick. Without them, he can't see anything.
That's me. I'm as blind as a bat without my glasses. I can't see anything. If you're very stupid, you could say, or if a person is very stupid, you could say that that person is as daft as a brush. And daft means silly or ridiculous. I think that's more common in British spoken English rather than American English, to be daft, but it means to be stupid, silly, ridiculous. So if someone is as daft as a brush, then that means they're very stupid. Don't be daft. Don't be silly.
If something is as dry as a bone, that means it's completely dry. Actually, we have another expression in English, which is bone dry. Simply the two words together, bone dry. Because apparently, when you leave bones a long time, they do become very, very dry. As dry as a bone.
And one that we had before, I think, as quiet as a mouse. If you make very little noise, you are as quiet as a mouse.
If you find something which weighs almost nothing, or if you're a person who weighs almost nothing, you could say that something is as light as a feather. Feather are those things which are like bits of hair stuck on a piece of stick, which form the outer part of birds. Yeah. Those things which they use to let the air flow in and out and keep them nice and light. That's a feather. So if you're as light as a feather, you're very light.
If you are as white as a sheet, then you're very pale. Your complexion has turned pale, maybe from fear or from shock. As you know, when Reza comes over here to record podcasts to my flat, we often have lunch together. And when I told Reza that we've decided to change our diet to an insect-only diet and that today we're having fried cockroaches, grasshoppers, and caterpillars for lunch, he went as white as a sheet. He went pale from fear.
As brave as a lion, that one won't surprise anybody at all, I guess. You could guess that one, couldn't you? In all cultures around the world, I think we think of lions as being very brave. They're the king of the jungles. A lion's frightened of nothing. So if you show a lot of courage, you're as brave as a lion.
And the next simile reminds me of my dad, who was a very stubborn person. He did not like changing his mind. When he decided something, he refused to change his mind or accept any advice. He was as stubborn as a mule. A mule is like a donkey, and when a mule or a donkey, when it decides not to move, it's very difficult to move it. So as stubborn as a mule. Do you think I take after my dad? Am I similar to him?
No, I don't think you're stubborn at all. Actually, I think you're very reasonable.
Oh, thank you.
Another thing I would not accuse Craig of is being as proud as a peacock. A peacock is that animal which has, we spoke earlier about feathers, right? It's an animal which has very, very extravagant feathers. If it's the male version, not the female version. The males are the ones which have very, very large and very colourful feathers, and they open them up and they show off to attract the female. So when they do that, they're being very proud. They're saying, hey, look at me. Aren't I fantastic, ladies? Have a look at this. So if you're as proud as a peacock, you're very proud.
Yeah, the female peacocks are quite brown and ordinary, aren't they? They're not particularly showy.
That's right.
A very smart or intelligent person could be referred to as being as bright as a button. You can have a very bright light, for example, but if a person is bright, that means they're intelligent, so as bright as a button. And we said before you could reverse these similes to have some comedic effect, so you could call someone as sharp as a bowling ball. If you know that a bowling ball is completely round and it is the opposite of being sharp like a knife, then obviously we understand that that person is not particularly sharp or intelligent.
Another common one is as clean as a whistle. That means spotlessly clean. A whistle is that thing that you put in your mouth and you blow on it and it makes a sound, kind of like as clean as a whistle, very clean.
As clear as mud is one that has been inverted. That's the opposite, because I'm sure you know that mud is not clear. So if something is confusing and you don't understand it, and Reza's just explained some grammar to you, and he says, do you understand that grammar? You can say, yes, Reza, it's as clear as mud, which means it's not clear whatsoever. It's not clear at all. As clear as mud.
As high as a kite means very noticeably affected after taking drugs. So kites fly, or can fly, very high in the sky. So if you think metaphorically, if you've taken some drugs and they've affected your thinking, you can imagine that you're flying. You're as high as a kite.
You can see all of these similes written in the show notes to this episode. Go to inglespodcast.com/613 and you'll see a list of these similes together with the definitions and explanations. You can be as fit as a fiddle. A fiddle, F-I-D-D-L-E, is a kind of violin. It's a musical instrument. And if you're fit, you're in good shape, you're healthy. So if you are described as being as fit as a fiddle, then you're in very good physical health.
We've already had one which is always used ironically, as clear as mud, meaning not at all clear. Here's another one. As useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. In other words, useless. So an ashtray is that little kind of bowl, that little round thing usually. It's very small with a hole at the top. You put your cigarette there and you flick it so that the ash, the bit which has been burnt, falls there. Now, can you imagine putting one of those on a motorbike? What's the point? Obviously, the wind's going to make the ash, the bit that's burnt, go everywhere. So if something is as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike, it is useless.
As useful or as welcome as a fart in an astronaut suit.
Yes, another common ironic one.
If you're very fast, you can be as quick as lightning, because lightning is very quick. Thunder and lightning, it happens quickly, so as quick as lightning.
As sick as a dog is a very common one. It means feeling very ill. I'm not sure why we say that, because of course dogs aren't often ill. They are sometimes, but poor dogs, they get a bad press. We say as sick as a dog if you're feeling very ill.
Especially if you've drunk too much alcohol and you've got a hangover. Yeah, I was as sick as a dog after going to the pub last night.
In other words, you were as drunk as a skunk.
Yes, as drunk as a skunk. Very, very drunk. Notice those two words rhyme, which makes that simile even more attractive. I was as drunk as a skunk last night. I don't know why they chose the animal skunk, because I've never seen a skunk, let alone a drunk skunk, but that's the simile, and it's fairly common.
As cheap as chips is a very common one in the United Kingdom. Not in America, though, because chips mean something different there. Then we're getting into American-British differences. But in the UK, if you say something's as cheap as chips, it's very economical, it's very cheap.
That's very common, isn't it? As cheap as chips. We spoke about being very drunk before. What about being very sober? Well, a very sober person, if you think of a judge, they're quite serious, aren't they, judges? They don't usually mess around too much or laugh or crack jokes. So as sober as a judge means not drunk at all. I went out with my friends, but I was driving. So at the end of the evening, I was as sober as a judge.
If something is straightforward, easy to understand, no complications, It's as easy as ABC.
And if you're describing a geographical area that has no mountains or hills, then you can say it's as flat as a pancake. Pancakes are very flat. As something that's as flat as a pancake is completely flat. I think the US state of Idaho, where they grow potatoes in huge fields, I think that's as flat as a pancake. No mountains, no hills, just completely flat.
Yeah. Looking out the window here as well, Valencia was pretty darn flat. There's not a single hill in Valencia city.
Yep.
If you're as deaf as a post, it means you're profoundly deaf or very deaf. You can hardly hear a thing.
And if you are looking after children, when you return them to their parents and their parents say, how did they behave? Were they well behaved? You can say, oh, yes, of course, they were very well behaved. They were as good as gold. So especially if children are as good as gold, then they behave well.
If you're talking about a tough guy, or it could be a woman as well, tough, someone who's hard, you wouldn't want to have an argument with them, you certainly wouldn't want to have a fight with them, you could say they're as hard as nails. When we say nails, we mean those little metallic objects that you hit with a hammer to build things, as hard as nails.
As mad as a hatter means a crazy person. If you describe someone as being as mad as a hatter, they're completely mad, completely crazy. So all of the similes we've mentioned up to now have been with the grammatical structure as, so as plus adjective plus as plus noun. Let's look at a few similes that use the word like. For example, to sleep like a log means to sleep deeply.
Like taking candy from a baby. That one is particularly popular in the United States, but we use it in Britain as well. It means very easy. Can you imagine robbing a baby? Can you imagine stealing candy from a baby? It'd be really easy, but you're not very nice if you do it. Like taking candy from a baby, really easy.
If you work very hard, you can be said to be working like a dog. Oh, I worked like a dog yesterday. I didn't stop all day. I worked very hard.
If something is like water off a duck's back, it's used to say that it has no effect at all on someone, because apparently ducks have some special chemical on their feathers, which means that their feathers don't get too wet, even though they're in the water all the time. The water seems to just flow off. It doesn't really get absorbed. So, like water off a duck's back, it has no effect.
You can watch someone like a hawk, H-A-W-K. A hawk is a bird of prey, similar to an eagle or an osprey. And if you know those birds, you know that they have wonderful eyesight. So if you're watching someone very closely or maybe very suspiciously, then you can say that he's watching me like a hawk, or you're watching her like a hawk.
If someone is like a bull in a china shop, they are very tactless. They have no tact, or they're very clumsy. So it could be metaphorically, or it could be literally physically. Can you imagine a bull, big animal, going crazy in a shop full of ceramic? We're talking about that type of china, not a Chinese shop, a shop with ceramic in it. Well, the results will be very messy indeed.
If something fits you well, if it's the perfect size or the perfect shape, specifically clothes, then you can describe it as fitting like a glove. I could say that Reza's shirt fits very well. It fits him like a glove.
To stick out like a sore thumb means to be very conspicuous. If you were the only man in a concert where there were 2,000 women, you would stick out like a sore thumb. You would be very conspicuous.
If something spreads like wildfire, then it circulates very rapidly. Unfortunately, due to climate change, we've had quite a few devastating, terrible wildfires in Europe and also in the US. and they spread very quickly. But you can also use this for information or news that travels quickly and circulates quickly. There was a rumor and it spread like wildfire. It spread very quickly.
If you smoke like a chimney, that means you smoke cigarettes constantly. If you can imagine smoke coming out of a chimney all day long, it never stops. You smoke like a chimney. I knew another one growing up, Craig, but I wonder, is it a regional variation or is it common? I also used to say smoke like a trooper.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, that works. A chain smoker.
Yeah. So a trooper is like a kind of soldier. Supposedly soldiers smoke a lot.
Or to swear like a sailor. Have you heard that one?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to swear a lot, say bad words. Another similar simile. Another simile is to be like two peas in a pod. Pea, the vegetable, P-E-A, and a pod is the green case that peas come in. So if you buy peas in the supermarket or in the greengrocer, you'll notice that they come in a green case, a green pod, it's called. And two peas in a pod means that two people are very similar in many ways.
If you're in a completely new and alien situation that you don't know anything about, you're like a fish out of water. So obviously, fish have to live in water. Take a fish out of water and it's going to be extremely uncomfortable.
Now, some of the similes that we've mentioned are quite obvious when you think about them. For example, someone who smokes like a chimney is smoking a lot. However, there are others in this list that are not so obvious. So let's look briefly at where these similes originate from. Where do they come from? Now, as drunk as a skunk, to be very drunk. I said before that I have never seen a drunk skunk, so I don't know where that comes from. But those words do rhyme. They have the same vowel sound, drunk and skunk. So maybe that's the reason that those go well together. And you probably noticed that a lot of these similes have animals in them, as brave as a lion, for example, as quiet as a mouse, and as drunk as a skunk.
The simile as fit as a fiddle has been used since about the 1600s, when English speakers used it metaphorically for a person whose body worked perfectly, worked very well, a bit like a fiddle. Remember, a fiddle is a violin, so a well-tuned instrument works well. So if you're as fit as a fiddle, you're in good shape.
The simile as blind as a bat, that comes from a misunderstanding back in medieval times when people didn't really understand animal behavior because many, many years ago people believed that bats were blind because they generally fly at night, they crash into things sometimes, they hit trees, and they live in dark caves. Now, of course, we know that they use echolocation and they actually see very well because of that. But very often these similes and other vocabulary comes from the time when people didn't really understand the natural world, and that's how they developed. So as blind as a bat goes all the way back to medieval times.
As mad as a hatter might not be so obvious. Well, first I better explain a hatter is a hat maker, people who make hats or mend hats. And in the past, they often used a chemical called mercury for their work. And apparently, exposure to mercury can cause some very unpleasant symptoms, such as slurred speech when you can't pronounce your words properly, tremors, stumbling, that means you can't walk properly, and in extreme cases, even hallucinations. And all of those things, of course, resemble mental problems, as if you were crazy. So that's the logical explanation for why we say, as mad as a hatter.
And the simile as cool as a cucumber, that might not be immediately obvious, but inside a cucumber, the temperature is often cooler than the air outside the cucumber because there's a lot of water inside cucumbers. So really, it kind of does make sense. If you open a cucumber and you eat the inside, it's probably cooler. So as cool as a cucumber.
There's a modern variant of that, which I really like because it's one of my favorite things to touch. Don't worry, this isn't going where you think it's going. This is a family podcast.
Family podcast, Reza.
We know that. As cool as a cucumber. I like the modern variant. As cool as the other side of the pillow. I like that a lot. Ever heard that? As cool as the other side of a pillow. So you sleep on one side of a pillow, right? Your head's there, and it gets hot. And this happens to me a lot. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, this is very hot. I don't like this. And I turn it over to the other side. Now it's nice and cool, particularly in the summer. I'm a big fan of as cool as the other side of the pillow, a modern version of as cool as a cucumber.
I like that. I think it's especially useful in Spain. Maybe not so much in the UK or a country like Poland or Russia, but definitely in Spain that works as a simile. And of course, you can make the noun the opposite for effect. There's a common simile which is as smooth as silk, because the material silk is very smooth. But if you want to say that something is not smooth, you can say it's as smooth as sandpaper. And sandpaper has glass in it or sand, and it's obviously the opposite of smooth. So why not try and invent your own similes and think of what other things remind you of the adjective? Now, as blind as a bat is a common one, but try to think what other things could be blind. A silly example will be a stick, a piece of wood. It's as blind as a stick. That works as well. Or the superhero Daredevil is a famous superhero who's blind. So it's as blind as Daredevil, doesn't see anything. You can play with these similes and make some of your own. And now it's your turn to practice your English. Reza, how can people get in touch with us?
Yeah, why not record some of your invented similes and send the audio to us as a voice message? You can do that through speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. There's a link in the notes. Or if you prefer, you could write them down and send an email. Or if you have a comment or question about anything, feel free to write to either Craig@inglespodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com.
Yes, let us know. Get in touch, especially if you're looking at this list of similes or you've just listened to them all and they're different in your language. So let us know if you have similar or completely different similes that express the same thing in your native language. Also, if you're a Spanish speaker and you want to improve your English with free and paid resources, visit the Mansion Ingles website at mansioningles.com. And for paid products, you can browse the online store at store.mansioningles.net.
If you'd like to have a full audio transcription of this podcast, you might want to consider joining our Patreon program as a sponsor. As a member of Patreon, that's Patreon, you'll receive the audio transcriptions, and also you'll get an invitation to join Craig for an informal chat on Zoom once a month. And that way you can get some extra practice for your speaking, and hopefully you'll get that warm, lovely, fuzzy feeling of someone who knows that they're helping in some way. There's a link in the show notes if you're interested. It's patreon.com/Ingles podcast.
Yes, you'll feel as warm as toast if you subscribe to the Patreon program. And we can't thank you individually, unfortunately, because the list is just too long. But we will say hello and thank you and welcome to our latest Patreon supporter. And that is Malgorzata Wawer. Thank you very much for joining the program. And next week, we're not sure what we're talking about, are we, Reza? But there will be an episode.
No, it is as clear as mud.
Next week, it's as clear as mud. Thank you so much for listening this week. And until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's bye-bye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.